First of all, welcome to Circular Economy 101. Before we actually talk about circular economy, we need to talk about the linear economy because that is the society or system that we're living in right now. So want to make sure that we all have this baseline understanding of the linear economy before we can go into the kind of more complicated topics of circular economy. So the idea of linear economy is that resource extraction equals disposal. Because if you think about it, the way that the circular economy, or the linear economy, sorry, operates is that people buy things, they own things, they use things, they might swap or trade with people if they're going to either be willing to put in a lot of effort or if they're going to be willing to put in a lot of money potentially. So for the most part, when people buy things, they own them, and then when they're done with them, they dispose of them. There is limited recycling that happens. The percentage of things that actually get recycled is quite low. If it's something in the blue bin, like things that are meant to be recycled, the percentage is higher. It's about 70% in Canada. But out of all plastics that get recycled, including the more durable plastics, it's only about 9%. So although recycling is a key factor in circular economy, which we'll discuss later, it doesn't really happen right now, which is why we can pretty confidently say that we're living in a linear economy, because as consumption increases, so does resource extraction, and so does disposal, because we have more stuff, so we need to make more stuff, and we need to throw away more stuff in the end. So a really big concept that we just need to all agree on up front is that in a linear economy, individuals buy things to own them. So they own the actual product, regardless of whether they're going to use it very much, if at all. So just to make sure that we understand all of the steps in the linear economy, resource extraction is when companies would actually mine minerals, hunt for their food, cut down trees, extract oil from the ground. This is like the raw material that we're taking out of natural spaces, essentially, to create our products. So for those of you who don't know, plastic, something that people love to talk about in the zero waste kind of community, but plastic is actually made from oil from the ground. So a lot of people I find don't actually connect that because it's something that's kind of like, you don't really think of oil when you see it, but it's actually made of fossil fuels. So the extraction process of oil is quite carbon intensive. So there are a lot of resources that even get into taking the resource out of the ground in the first place. A lot of energy, which is also oil for the most part, and just like effort of people even. So depending on the resource that we're talking about, the resource extraction process could be more or less intensive, but in the end, the first step, regardless of what you're talking about, is in order to make stuff, we have to get the raw materials required to create it. So in the second step of the process, then we go to manufacturing. So this is when the companies actually turn the raw materials like oil or like tree, like lumber, into paper. This is the process of going from the raw material into the actual product. So obviously, depending on the product, this can be more or less complicated again, but nonetheless, it's an important step in the process to think about because it's additional resources being put towards creating that product for us. So then the next step is distribution and retail. So this is when companies that go to sell a product will buy wholesale. But the big key thing about this when you're buying and selling products, again, is that in a linear economy, people typically purchase to own it. So there isn't any sharing usually that goes on, at least not so much anymore. And at this point, this is pretty much the only point of contact that customers will have with a given company based on that product purchase. Like you don't often go back to companies to get things repaired unless it's like a phone or something like that. So this is usually the only point of contact that businesses currently have with customers in this whole process of that single products that we're talking about. And then the fourth step, is customer use. So this is a phase that depending on the product, you can have either higher or lower utility of a product. So if you think about it, say I have this notebook. I use this all the time, right? So I purchased this once. I use it like every day. It's something that, to me, like the resources of this product is worth it because I actually use it a lot. But say you have something that you purchased one time and you thought it was going to be a great purchase, but then it ends up that maybe you don't use it as much as you had hoped for. So the utility of that product, or the utilization of that product, is quite low because you're kind of, you have it, you owned it, it was made, but it's sitting around in your house and you're not really using it that much. So the whole point of creating that product, like, was it really worth it for the couple times that you're going to use it? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But that's something to think about when we're talking about the life cycle of a product as well. And then, of course, there's the disposal phase. So when people don't need something anymore, or if it breaks, for example, if it's something that's really hard to repair, or someone, for whatever reason, you can't use the item, it often goes to disposal. There are a lot of things that go to landfill that shouldn't go to landfill, because this is largely right now dependent on whether me, the person who owns that product, needs that product anymore. It's not really asking if there is someone that needs the product. Typically, people will throw something away if it doesn't serve them specifically, because either the cost or the effort associated with finding another home for it is maybe not the most efficient, or maybe people are just too lazy to do it. I'm not sure. But currently, right now, at the end of this life cycle, people probably throw things away. The circular economy is where we take that linear process and kind of like loop it all together in a circle. So this one, in order to make that actually happen, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But theoretically, that's all you're doing, is you're finding loops within that to try to eliminate that linear relationship between resource extraction and disposal, and see if you can increase the utility of something, if you can extend the life cycle of a product, if you can share the product. So here we're focusing on, as it says, reusing, repairing, sharing, remanufacturing, and last case is recycling. So trying to keep those resources in service as much as possible. So there are a couple ways that this can look in a circular economy, because obviously if something breaks, you can't use it. For example, like if you have an iPhone, the way it stands right now, given the way that this iPhone is created, is I'm not able to, say the camera breaks, I'm not able to take the camera out and replace it, right? These aren't really made in a circular, with a circular economy in mind. These are made with a linear economy in mind, because companies, as they're creating products, if your camera breaks, they want you to buy a new phone, right? Because that profit for them is very high, the way that they see it in a linear economy. But we'll discuss how circular economy actually does have financial benefits for companies as well. But the three kind of phases, I guess, of a product that you can think of it in terms of breaking it down starts with the whole product, so my whole iPhone, right? And then the second one would be modular parts. So say you could take this apart, like you can take the camera off and replace it. The modular part would be that camera of the phone. And then the materials would be things like the glass and the raw materials inside, like the precious metals and metal and stuff like that, and the plastics. That's like, as you break it down, it becomes less valuable, but those are kind of like the three phases of a product. So if we take like a old landline phone, for example, you could have the whole product, right? You could have the receiver, you could have the base of it and the cord connecting it, and that would be the whole working phone. Then you can also just have the receiver, and then you can also just have the product material. Like if you were to chop it all up and recycle it, you would just have that plastic material. So as you go down the line, the value of a working phone is obviously way higher than the modular parts, which is higher than the materials. But the problem right now with the circular economy, or sorry, with a linear economy, is that we don't really value the modular parts, right? For this, they call it the butterfly diagram. It's basically a roadmap to see how you can use products in a circular economy. So on the left side is the biological cycle. So this would be used for natural materials like plants, animals, like cotton, even certain fabrics that are natural. And then on the right-hand side, it's the technical cycles. So this would be things like technology, products that you have to like make, like glass, metal, stuff like that. So when you're looking at a product, of course, there's going to be power required to make the product, and then mining and materials are likely required. But the idea with the circular economy is to minimize that. So when you're designing your products, you want to be thinking about these cycles at the bottom. So once you mine your raw materials and you have your renewable energy, then it gets manufactured into parts, and then it gets manufactured into a whole product, and then there's potentially a service provider on the product. But then we'll go to the technical cycles first because it's easier. But then when it gets to the end user, there are a couple different cycles that you want to go through. So you can either have maintenance structures. So it's really easy to repair things like your phone, for example. Like if this phone was designed in a way that I could easily repair it, so I could just swap out the camera, that would be more circular than it is right now. But then another option would be to reuse or redistribute the phone. So that would be, you'd need a service provider to do that, because you need reverse logistics to say, take a broken or a no longer used phone back, and then they can redistribute it to another user. So that would be where you're increasing the utility of a phone or the utilization of a phone. Say I only need it on Mondays and someone else needs it on Tuesdays, which isn't a realistic example, but just like go with me on it. So then you would have reverse logistics incorporated in your business structure so that you could say, okay, I can take your phone back from you when you're not using it, and then we can redistribute it later to someone else who will use it. And that's kind of like a sharing economy type thing. So like Buns is a good example of that. If you've heard of them, it's an app where individuals can go and share between themselves. So it's circular in the sense that it allows people to find people who have demand for the things that they don't need anymore. But in a circular economy, that would be something that would be like a business to business transaction, or something that's more scaled. So if you can't repair it anymore, or you can't reuse it or redistribute it, the next step would be to refurbish it or remanufacture it, which means to take some components back of products, or even the materials back. Well, actually, no, not materials, because that's in recycling, but you can take some of the products back and use pieces of it to put it back together into a new product. So say, again, on the phone example, my phone was broken, pieces of it were broken, so I didn't want to use it anymore. And I could bring it back to the original manufacturer, and they would take pieces from my phone and put it into new phones. So Apple does this right now to a certain degree. Like they'll reuse the precious metals in their phones. They have like a very technologically advanced robotic arm that does it for them, which is kind of cool. But obviously it's not, they don't refurbish everything, but when they need to, they can take out components of old phones and reuse them for new models of phones, because the parts don't necessarily have to change with every model, right? Sometimes it's just little things that change. So making sure that they're using the materials that come back to them in their new products. So then if you go another cycle out, say you can't refurbish it, you can't remanufacture it, say like there's that broken component of the phone, maybe there are pieces of that you can recycle. So in a circular economy, right now we just go straight to recycling, right? So this is where I'm saying that we're missing all these middle pieces in between, where you can take the parts apart or reuse specific components of products to make new ones, because in the very last case scenario is when you want to recycle it. So that's when you're breaking it down to the materials. So say like that plastic of the phone or the glass or whatever. And that's when you can only recycle like pure materials coming out of it. So for the biological cycles, then it's a little bit different. I guess it's more simple because there's less to it than the technical cycles. But same thing, you go to the parts manufacturer, the product manufacturer, and the service provider. say this is more applicable to something like textiles than like food. But you would go through the regular initial pieces, and then when it gets down to the consumer, then you have different cascades that happen where it's like your own like maintenance. I guess you could also redistribute and reuse things, and like having that sharing economy within the organic side as well. But then there are some additional steps, because if it's truly organic, so say like this won't work for textiles that are like a blend of like cotton and polyester, because polyester is plastic. But say we had like truly natural fabrics, you can go through extraction of biochemical feedstock. I'm not an expert, so I'm not going to pretend that I am, but there are like these scientific ways that you can get some biochemicals, I guess, out of it. But then when you go to the anaerobic digestion or composting, from that, we do this in Toronto, from that you can get biogas, which can be used as a fuel. So right now, I think it's in Durham, anything that goes in your green bin, when it's composted, they actually take biogas out of that, and then they also get composting out of it. So it's like, it's not super productive, but it is quite productive as like a last resort to at least get energy out of it or get something out of it. And the idea, though, is that once you have the composting, then the compost goes back into the natural spaces. So this is like restoring soils and things that are currently being flooded of all of their nutrients. And then it goes back into the farming and collection. So like to enhance farms and enhance crops and things like that. So the idea with a circular economy is that you're not just on the technical side, like reducing waste, but it's actually regenerative in nature. Because if you're actually following this, like say you had proper separation between the technical cycles and the biological cycles, then any of our farming or food or agriculture, anything like that would actually be restorative, which would be a net positive, because right now, as our agriculture systems work, we're actually ruining the lands that we're farming on. So if we could take this kind of circular economy concept and make it act like really what's happening, then that would be quite productive. So of course, with anything, like there will be leaks that happen. Like not everything is going to be perfectly captured, but the idea is to minimize the leakage. So anything that does kind of come out of this system that isn't reused or used for restoration, the hope is that we could get some energy recovery, and then some will end up going to landfill, just being realistic. But the idea is that we'll like vastly minimize that. So our first example, part of the Impact Zero Foundation, we also have an Impact Zero network where green businesses kind of work with us to establish these circular systems. And one of those is Scrunchies from Scraps. So the owner, her name is Sarah, she makes scrunchies out of repurposed materials. So she has built partnerships with local, I guess they're probably smaller manufacturers, but textile manufacturers in the city, and any scraps that they don't use, she takes them from them and she sews scrunchies out of them. And the amazing thing about this is not only is she using waste, but she gets her fabrics for free, because the way that these manufacturing companies and a lot of businesses see their waste is as a cost, because they usually have to pay to get rid of it. So for her, obviously this is a special case because she has a relationship with these manufacturers, but she's able to completely reuse their scraps and create them into something new. So if we were to map this on the Ellen MacArthur diagram, she's pretty much sitting in this refurbish, remanufacture space, right? Because she's taking the parts that currently are existing and taking them, instead of going to landfill, she's remanufacturing them into something else that's completely usable. And honestly, probably expanding their life a lot more than if she had remanufactured them into clothes, because I feel like people keep scrunchies longer than they would keep clothes. So that would be extending the life cycle of the product, where the product is textiles. So having textiles as a really big problem in the city, this is great. She's a smaller maker, but things like these can be scaled up in and become actually like quite huge ways of mitigating textile waste. So our next example is Fairphone. So this is a Dutch company, and they have a modular phone. So as you can see, they have a little piece for the camera, they have a little piece for the battery. I don't know what the other ones are, but the whole idea is that this is basically like a puzzle of a phone. A couple, I think in like 2012 or 13, Google was working with a small startup on something similar. Unfortunately, it got cut when Google was trying to kind of limit, I think, their hardware products. But Fairphone is alive and well in the Netherlands. And essentially what you do is you can swap out key components as they break, because it's inevitable that they'll break eventually. But the idea is that like this phone will stay with you forever. So also actually a fun little tidbit is all of their gold and like their precious metals are all fair trade as well. So it has a social cause with it as well as an environmental cause. So this one is hitting not only the maintenance, because people then can do this themselves and they can fix it themselves, but again, it's in the refurbish and remanufacturing space. It's a little bit more complicated, but the idea is they could repair the parts as they break and give them back to people as they're requesting other parts. So that's like a very circular example that is quite difficult actually to solve, because a lot of people have tried. And this was the only one that I saw that was still actually alive. I'm not going to try to pronounce this one, but it's an eco-industrial park in Europe. I forget. I think it's in Denmark, I believe. But it's really cool. This is a picture of it. It looks super European. But the idea is that this has been like an ecosystem of businesses who use the waste of one business and the other business uses it as an intake for their stuff. So for example, one of them, they require a lot of heat for something, and any excess heat is captured and used to heat something that requires less heat, but the heat's used in another process of another one of those buildings. And having them all physically together obviously makes that a lot easier. But the interesting thing about this park is that it actually was not set up to necessarily be an eco park. Like the companies that had ended up there, they didn't necessarily have intentions up front to be sharing waste, but there was a business case for it, because if someone is just trying to get rid of something, and as I mentioned previously, a lot of businesses pay to have someone take their waste away for them, would you not want to have it as, instead of an expense, it's actually a revenue stream for you now, because you're consistently selling your waste to a company that gets a discount on it, because they now don't have to pay someone from probably far, far away to come and extract the material from them somewhere else and then bring it to them. So it's quite interesting how this has evolved over like 20, probably 30 years now, maybe more. But if you were to map all of this on the butterfly diagram, this would be part of the reuse and redistribute, and then also refurbish and remanufacture, because some of the raw materials are inputs to creating their other products. But then of course, obviously energy reduction or energy recovery, because the energy that would have otherwise been wasted is now being used for a productive purpose, eliminating the need entirely for them to have any net positive or net increase in carbon emissions as a result of their energy. So for them, that's entirely clean energy, which for big corporations is very important, because a lot of corporations actually spend a lot of money purchasing offsets for the carbon that they do emit. So it's not only environmentally friendly, but it's also, again, shown in the business case. So I wanted to give you an example of one of the projects that Impact Zero is working on, super high level. So essentially, we right now are trying to tackle the textile situation in Toronto. So if you were to go through kind of the linear life cycle of textiles, you would start with plants. This is very simplified, obviously. You would go to manufacturing and dyeing and all of that harmful stuff. And then it goes to threading, which is also an incredibly resource intensive step. And then the fabric gets made into products, which go to stores. And most of them probably get to customers who will eventually throw them out. And a lot of it actually still does come from the stores into landfills directly. You could argue that there are arrows from every step of this process into landfill. For example, the dyeing process, oftentimes companies will just completely spew their literally black water into natural spaces, contaminating nearby communities. So obviously this is a big issue. And so we wanted to kind of see what that could look like if you were to map it out. What would that look like if Impact Zero could have some sort of system to help out with this problem? So the magic happens here. So if you were to map this out in like a circular model, you can see a couple loops here, and it looks kind of confusing up front. But so you have your consistent linear stuff. So like you're gonna have to make some products in the regular process, because the way that textiles are, you can't really design it out. Like you can't make it modular like you could a phone. I guess you could, but it would be a little bit more complicated. But in the end, you still need like fabrics. So when you kind of go through that initial process and you get to the store, and so obviously people will purchase it from the store. Our hope is to help educate people to be able to repair their own clothes or connect them with repair businesses and seamstresses who can help them repair their clothes to make them last longer. But then say something gets ripped, or there is some sort of stain on it, or it's otherwise unwearable. The idea is that we would figure out some way to be a point of contact to take that material from somebody. So instead of giving it to landfill, give it to us. We'll figure out what to do with it. And same goes for stores, because a lot of waste, as I mentioned previously, like there are arrows from each of these steps going to landfill. So we could argue that there will also be arrows for each of these steps, well, most of these steps, that could potentially come into Impact Zero in some capacity. And the idea is that we would connect the people who have waste with the people who want waste. So say there's another store or there are independent makers who could then have a consistent supply of that textile product. Because given my research that I did a little while ago, trying to like make products out of repurposed materials, the problem I was having is that like a lot of people, a lot of makers would be willing to do it. They just didn't have a consistent supply of textiles. So our hope is to connect the people who have the textiles with the people that need the textiles. And then that way you're inherently creating these loops. So you're not only creating, this is like that repair loop, that initial repair one going from consumer to consumer, but then there's also, through Impact Zero, you're having a refurbish and remanufacture loop here. And then you're potentially even having a redistribute loop, because if you think of like Winner's business model, they're essentially redistributing. But then at the very end, like last case scenario is textile recycling, which right now the technology for textile recycling is quite early. So I know H&M has a couple initiatives where they're trying to do it, but based on what I've read, it's quite expensive to do. And the technology obviously has room for improvement before it's like financially feasible. But yeah, so this is how, like, if you map out a product, you can do this with any product. Like you can do this with a pen, right? And you can see like what is the life cycle of a pen from manufacturing to landfill, and where is there opportunity to create these loops? Do you maybe have to redesign the pen so it's more modular? Do you maybe have to have some sort of leasing model where instead of me purchasing like this pen to own, I'm purchasing it to use and I can return it to you? Maybe a pen wouldn't make a lot of sense from like a business case perspective, but we do it right now with cars, right? You can lease a car. Most cars that are created actually are leased. So that's already something that's alive and well. And same with like like Airbnbs, you're essentially, that's also like part of the sharing economy, right? So there are lots of ways that you can implement circular thinking, as long as you're closing those loops and figuring out ways to 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 bring like the landfill kind of out of the picture and seeing how we can bring it back to earlier stages in that process. So in a nutshell, how to be circular, if you're going to try to attempt to answer this with 4 easy points, it would be to redesign our products to be modular, fixable, and recyclable. Because if you don't have proper product design from the start, then no matter what services you want to implement, it's not going to work. Like right now, if I wanted to fix this camera, I can't fix the camera because the product's not designed in a way for me to actually be able to do that. And then the second kind of point of how to be circular would be to sell the service of a product, not sell, like don't sell the product, just sell the use of it, right? So say I want to have a subscription service for earphones. That's actually one that in an Ellen MacArthur course that I'm taking, they talked about. So it's quite interesting. This service that they have is like, you can have like one ear thing, another ear thing, and the connector between them, and you are renting the service of their earphones. So if a piece breaks, you send it back and you bring it back. It doesn't impact the cost to you, I believe, because it's kind of structured into their pricing structure. But the idea is you would just kind of sell the use of it. And I think it was an Accenture study that I was reading where it said that this type of leasing model, it costs about a third of the price of purchasing a product for the customer. So it's a third less expensive for me to have a lease on something than purchase it. But then on the flip side, for businesses, they make 3 times more because you're only buying the product one time and you're selling it like 20 times. So it's quite financially feasible depending on the product. But what is also interesting is that then the companies are incentivized to make better quality products. So right now, light bulb, for example, like they were designed to have a specific lifespan. Like they are designed in a way that they will die in a year and you'll have to buy a new one because the light bulb companies want to sell you more products. So imagine if they were incentivized to actually make a really, really, really good light bulb, and say you don't need it anymore, you can send it back to them and get a new one if you want a different model, or having that, and then they can sell it to someone else who needs that. So kind of increasing that utility of the product, but then also increasing your profits in the meantime, because you're only purchasing that thing one time. It might be a little bit more expensive to make it higher quality, but I mean, that's marginal compared to the actual price of the product in most cases. So then the third bullet would be to build in reverse logistics capabilities. So this is absolutely necessary, because if you can't get the product back, you're not going to get it back. And if it's not easy to get back, you're also probably not going to get it back. So an example that is in practice right now of reverse logistics would be like Staples. They're in the recycling side, so it's not like full products per se, but they have their e-waste recycling, which they say that they will collect any type of product. They'll properly recycle it because they have the connections with the recycling companies, and everything's good. But imagine if you could have like that central drop off as well, but instead of going to recycling, they have a deal with, say, Samsung, where they'll take out all the Samsung ones, or they'll have like bins for Samsung. And then Samsung will go and reuse the materials of that product. Without that kind of point of contact for the customers to be able to drop it off, people probably won't drop it off. So that part has to be really easy. But if you don't have reverse logistics, you can't get your stuff back, because in a circular economy, your customers can end up being your suppliers if you're relying on them having to do the drop-offs as your supply chain, basically, or at least a portion of your supply chain. Maybe you don't want to rely entirely on them, but it would drastically reduce the amount of resource extraction that you'd have to do if you can take your stuff back. And then the very last point is more on the individual side, but it would be promoting, sharing, repairing, and just having individuals value their stuff in general, because a lot of waste happens of people just not properly taking care of what they own, or maybe not caring about it too much to the point of making sure that they make it last as long as possible. But if you want to share with people right now, I would highly recommend getting the Buns app. Obviously, in a pandemic situation, you might not want to be doing too much trading, but it's interesting to see kind of what's on there, because it's surprising the type of stuff that you can get. And then also learning how to repair. I feel like a lot of people in this time have maybe spent some time sewing or being a little bit more domestic, and just learning how to repair your clothes, or your like mechanic products even, just to make sure that you're actually making that product last longer. Because if you can use it for twice as long, you're going to buy half the stuff, is kind of the concept. And yeah, just making sure that you're valuing everything that you own. So impactzero.ca is our Twitter, and _CA is Twitter, and then .ca is Instagram. Priyanka, thank you for coming. How do I see COVID impacting the circular economy? That's an interesting question. I think it's really hard to say, because I find that like people are being more cognizant of like the things that they own and the limitations of like not being able to just go to a store and buy whatever they want necessarily. So I think people will get a little bit more handy. I hope that people are repairing things that they own, like clothes. But also kind of in like the food space, I think it's really good that people have like been baking and cooking on their own too, because like just from like a packaging perspective, there's a lot of packaging obviously in food. So if you can, and like takeout. So that's something that'll be interesting to see, but it's hard to tell. I think people will just be more mindful of what they got. But yeah, thank you so much for coming. Any other questions? I'll stay on for a little bit, but if not, I hope you have a great night, and I hope that you come to our next one as well. We'll post more info soon.